Last week we saw how the warm primaries, cool primaries system became dogma and led to confusing paint mixing advice. This week we'll look at color wheels from the 1980s to the 2020s, color wheels that demonstrate the gradual deconstruction of the double primary theory. First up, we ask, what if we abandon warm and cool? Then what if we ditch the primaries? Then what if we ditch the splits? And finally, what if we ditch the wheel itself? The Grumbacher chart we ended on last week is not an outlier. We noted how it avoids the terms warm and cool. And the fact is, a lot of artists teaching around that time began to question the usefulness of those labels. Color temperature is a real thing, by the way, but it doesn't describe a hue in isolation. It describes a system of color relationships in context. Warming or cooling a color can involve shifting its hue, its saturation, its lightness, or how it's juxtaposed against another color. So to call a red pigment warm or cool on its own is really just an imprecise way to say it leans more scarlet or more crimson. In other words, how it leans in hue. This then is the Michael Wilcox mixing palette. It ties in directly with his 1987 book, Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green. The book argues that color bias, or lean, is a better framework than color temperature. And here's how that plays out on the Wilcox palette. Say I have a quinacridone red. Wilcox says it has a blue bias, and therefore I'd place it in this well on the palette. How about this cobalt blue? I can place it in this well, indicating it has a green lean. And according to Wilcox's thinking, if I were to mix this red and this blue together, I'd be crossing one of these dividing lines, and therefore I'd end up with a muddy or grayish purple. A clean or vibrant mixture comes from primaries biased the same way, leaning toward the same secondary. So if I want a vivid purple, I should add a blue to my palette here on this side of the line, a blue like ultramarine. With the bias framework, we don't have to worry about which blue is warm or cool. We just have to know if it leans toward the secondary color we're trying to mix or not. But Wilcox's concept of color bias is based on a very flawed understanding of color. Wilcox reasons that a pure yellow paint would reflect only yellow wavelengths, and that an orange biased yellow would reflect more orange wavelengths, and a green biased yellow would reflect more green wavelengths. To him, this explains why an orange biased yellow mixes cleaner oranges and vice versa. First of all, a paint reflecting only the wavelengths we consider yellow, say 570 through 590 nanometers, would not be a bright pure yellow, but a dim olive or amber. Why? Well, that's not a lot of light. So a bright yellow paint needs to reflect a wider range of wavelengths, more light, that will additively mix to yellow in our eyes. Here's a spectrophotometer scan of a patch of bismuth yellow, which Wilcox would say is green biased and reflects less orange. This scan is showing us that, in fact, it reflects a large amount of orange, and red, and yellow and green, and even some cyan light. Here's a scan of cadmium yellow medium, which Wilcox would say is orange biased. But look, same amount of orange reflectance as the bismuth. In fact, both need a lot of orange and red reflection just to register as bright yellow rather than as dim olive. Is either paint biased toward green? Well, the bismuth happens to reflect a little bit more green, but it doesn't make sense to think of that green component as an impurity. Again, it's a necessary component of both of these yellows, even though they vary in hue. If the cadmium didn't also reflect green, it would be completely scarlet, like this scan of cadmium red light shows. As David Briggs puts it on his excellent website, huevaluechroma.com, the orange and green wavelengths reflected by a yellow paint are not impurities in the yellow, they are additive components of the yellow. So Wilcox's physics didn't hold up, but the bias language stuck anyway, and so did the convention of drawing three dividing lines on the wheel. For example, here's Gene Dovey in 1986, Nita Leland in 98, Patty Malika in 2013. They all present the concept this way, with these splits, and indeed this pervasive graphic strategy is probably why the term double primary has largely been replaced with split primary. But now I want to pick apart this color bias framework further by examining mixtures that cross the lines versus those that don't. Here are four oranges I mixed: bismuth yellow and quinacridone rose, bismuth yellow and cadmium red, new gamboge with quinacridone rose, and new gamboge with cadmium red. I tried to match the hue of all four mixtures to make a fair comparison. Split primary thinking tells me that the cleanness, or rather the chroma, should be different for each mixture. The highest chroma mixture should be new gamboge with cadmium red because they are both orange biased. So I scanned these mixtures and the pigments that I used to mix them with, and I plotted them in OKLCH. And guess what? They were all about dead even for chroma, these four mixtures. It's because of how the spectral math worked out. Look at bismuth yellow plus cadmium red and how it creates this long, low plateau of green reflection. And new gamboge and cadmium red make a sort of higher, narrower plateau of green reflection. But our cone cells, the ones sensitive to medium wavelength light, count up those photons the same way. So under the right light source, we literally can't see the difference. I did the same mixing exercise to get these four greens. Here we can see the kind of visual results that support split primary thinking. Different amounts of chroma, as expected. But is the explanation that ultramarine and new gamboge both have more red in them, canceling the green and darkening it? No. There was just less green to begin with. And in fact, both greens made with bismuth yellow reflect more orange and red light than the greens made with the new gamboge. I also scanned some purples, the ultramarine and quinacridone rose, which should have given me a more chromatic purple, according to split primary thinking, because they both lean the same way, actually gave me a near black. I'd have to add white to get more chroma out of that purple, which kind of throws a monkey wrench into the whole color bias explanation. I want you to notice, though, how quinacridone rose, a supposedly blue-biased red, is still way up here on this chart. Remember, I've plotted this in OKLCH, which means it's not a red, yellow, blue traditional wheel. And the ideal subtractive primary, magenta, is actually down here. So, shouldn't the splits of the split primary model be aligned with cyan, magenta, and yellow? Merv Moriarty thought so. He developed his approach to teaching color in rural Australia over decades in collaboration with fashion designer Prue Acton, his wife, and they published this color wheel in 2018. The overlay shows path AB, which predicts a vibrant mixture result, a result near the high chroma edge of the wheel. Notice this path only works if the overlay is rotated so that A and B are within the same sector, so the path doesn't cross one of the lines. These other paths are for pigment pairs that do cross a line. You can see that the further apart in hue those paints are, the more their paths curve through the low chroma colors toward the center of the wheel. Very clever, and I love it, but these curved paths are hinting at a larger truth, the truth about paint mixing that's not captured by splitting the wheel into three sections. So, what if we ditch the splits and think in terms of gamuts instead? Who tried this first? Maybe Joy Turner Luke in her 1996 Guide to the Munsell System, which was packaged with the new Munsell student color set. Instead of trying to fit 6 pigments to a split primary color wheel, she maps the range covered by mixtures of 6 pigments. That's what a gamut is, the possible range that can be mixed by a given set of colorants in terms of their hue, lightness, and chroma, measured absolutely, rather than in relative squishy terms like most color wheels. And in David Lloyd's 2007 color book, he makes a detailed argument for why split primary thinking doesn't actually make sense if we consider the geometry of the whole gamut. Here he shows pairs of reds, yellows, and blues and how they can't cover as wide an area as an evenly spread set of 6 paints. Lexi Sundall's 2012 color wheel is built on this insight. Aimed at acrylic painters, her book is based on great research, including handprint.com, which we talked about in episode 9. Sundall explains that the split primary palette is valid but arbitrary and not founded on current scientific understanding of color. She suggests a palette of 6 evenly spaced hues for higher chroma mixtures. And ultimately, if you want truly exceptional high chroma colors, you can try Sundall's 12 primary palette. On the one hand, I think there's logic to Sundall's approach, but on the other hand, a 12 primary color circle is really a curated pigment list, not a tool for understanding how colorants mix. So the last part of the split primary color wheel to deconstruct is the wheel itself. In other words, we ask, why is it a circle? The circle's problem to begin with is that it can't, as is, help us predict the chroma of a paint mixture. If we draw a straight line between any two colors, it suggests that close together pigments will give us higher chroma mixtures, and far apart or complementary pigments will give us zero chroma or neutral mixes. But we get in trouble here because, as Moriarty and Joy Turner Luke knew, paints don't mix in straight lines. This fact bedevils painters in two main ways. The first involves pigments of an intermediate distance in hue. Some pairs give us more chromatic mixtures than a straight line, and others give us less chromatic mixtures than a straight line. The second problem is the green lean, the fact that color mixtures are greatly affected by how much the two pigments' spectral reflection or absorption of green wavelengths overlaps or doesn't. But it turns out we can solve both of these problems by abandoning the circle. Historically, the theory and eventual discovery that the human eye is sensitive to 3 overlapping ranges of wavelengths led some artists to arrange pigments in a triangle. This was a key feature of Hardesty Murata's color system, which we discussed briefly in episode 11. It was co-developed with the Ashcan School painters like John Sloan, and the best extant example is actually found in John Sloan's 1939 book, The Gist of Art. But Murata still placed his hues based on the red, yellow, blue model, and he doesn't account for the green lean. Enter Ginger Markley. In her 2023 color mixing triangle, she puts cyan, magenta, and yellow at the corners and shifts the zone of low chroma or near neutral colors closer to the red-orange side, widening the green side. She's also charted pigments not just by their hue and chroma, but by their tinting strength, and the result is the best chart I've come across for predicting the hue and chroma of different paint mixtures. In the end, I'd agree with Lexi Sundell that the split primary palette is fine. It's valid. It's one of any number of valid limited palette approaches. But when it becomes dogma, then it becomes an artist's sole understanding of color mixture, and then it becomes limiting. The split primary palettes are based on the underlying truth that color mixing is sort of triangular in nature, but it obscures that nature. The bias idea, or the dividing lines seen in so many split primary wheels, it's really just an incomplete solution to the fact that a color circle is actually warping the inherent triangle of color mixture. Anyway, thanks for sticking around for the full video, and I will see you next time on Color Wheel Wednesday.